Chris Mackowski for Emerging Civil War. I am at the intersection of Mackowski Church Road and modern-day Jefferson Davis Highway. Standing behind me is the Mackowski Church. It was here mid-morning on May 21st, 1864, that Ulysses S. Grant, George Gordon Meade, and their staffs pulled the church pews out of the church, set them up in this yard behind me, and had a council of war. I'm always stunned by one of those pictures. There were 4 of them that were captured by the photographer, Timothy O'Sullivan. And I'm always stunned by one of those pictures, which actually shows Meade and Grant together, but Grant is literally leaning over Meade's shoulders. And that picture sums up the relationship between those two generals here during the course of the Overland Campaign. Grant had intended to be hands-off, and as the campaign goes on, he takes more and more of a hands-on approach with the Army and essentially relegates Meade to the role of a staff officer. Now, I don't know about you, but just imagine if your boss was just literally standing over your shoulder all the time. That would get a little bit frustrating. So no wonder Meade starts to get a little cranky by this point. We're going to do something a little bit different today than we've done in past videos here as we've been tracing the Overland 155. Through the miracle of technology, we're going to follow the Army as it marches down toward the North Anna River, specifically following the 2nd Corps under Winfield Scott Hancock. He's going to be dangled out there by Grant as bait, with the hope of trying to draw Lee out of his entrenchments to Spotsylvania. And Grant's going to hope that Lee will pounce on Hancock, and when Lee does, Grant, with the rest of the Army, will pounce on Lee. So we're going to follow that route down toward Bowling Green, Milford Station, with an eye on the North Anna River. As dawn began to lighten the sky for Hancock's men, they saw what a bountiful, rich, beautiful area of Virginia they were going through. It had never been touched by the hard hand of war. One soldier said that it was easily the best agricultural area he had yet seen in the state. As the column continued marching, they passed the location where Stonewall Jackson had died a year earlier, Guinea Station. One officer from Maine said that everyone agreed we were having an easier time of it since Jackson had been killed. Later in the afternoon on the 21st, Ulysses S. Grant, George Gordon Meade will come down to this area about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They'll actually make their headquarters at the next plantation over. The owner of that, Mr. Motley, accuses Grant of trying to burn down his house with a cigar. So Grant will get up and quietly go for a walk, and he'll come here to the Chandler plantation. Mrs. Chandler will be delighted to greet Grant, take him into the building, talk about Stonewall Jackson, tell about Jackson's last days. Grant and Jackson had only known each other briefly back at West Point, but Grant said yes, indeed, he was a fine officer, he was a gentleman, and then eventually is able to excuse himself and get back to the Army and tend to details as the march continues on. Through the miracle of technology, I am now in the town square in Bowling Green, Virginia. Winfield Scott Hancock's cavalry escort under Alfred Torbert got here at about 7 o'clock in the morning. The infantry came marching in down that road at about 9 a.m. Hundreds of slaves greeted them as liberators, and as soon as they got here, they ransacked the town. One soldier said that operating in enemy territory as we were, we acted like a swarm of locusts. They're going to be here just for a couple hours, and then they're going to reform and make the next 4-mile march to Milford Station. Before we leave, take a quick look here at the Sidney King Arts Center in the background. Also, the courthouse, Confederate monument is standing there. So beautiful little spot, definitely worth a stop down here. Sidney King was an artist who had painted a lot of murals for the Park Service back in the 60s. And so his work has been seen all around the country. As parks began to modernize in the 1990s, many of his paintings were retired, but they were fortunately collected back here at this depository. You can see it in the background, the Sidney King Arts Center. And so it brings back a lot of fond memories for people who have visited some of those old-time parks. Cool to see his work still preserved and displayed and honored. We're going to head down the road to Milford Courthouse, following the 2nd Corps. Hancock's orders allowed him to go as far as the Confederate supply base at Hanover Junction, but really he's just going to get as far here as Milford Station. Even as his troops are getting back into position, or back into formation at Bowling Green, his cavalry under Torbert is going to move forward, trying to clear the road ahead. He gets about 4 miles down here to Milford Station, only to discover Confederates. Colonel William Terry's brigade is coming up from the Richmond defenses on his way to go reinforce Lee. not realizing that Lee's moving his way down in this direction. Terry and his men try to put up a fight, but they realize that Torbert's men are backed by infantry, and so they're going to then try to fall back in that direction toward the Mattaponi River and to try to control the river crossing there. But again, overwhelming federal numbers are going to push them back even further until they take up position on a high hill just to my right. Hancock's going to get down here. His overwhelming numbers are going to drive those Confederates away. They are going to eventually escape with the help of Wade Hampton's cavalry. They'll join up with Lee's army. But now Hancock is going to start to get nervous. He's way down here running into Confederates he wasn't expecting. His supply line, his line of communications are stretched way back through enemy territory. The 9th Virginia Cavalry, which was raised in Carolina and Spotsylvania counties, has been harassing him, slowing his communications. He feels out of touch with Grant. And I think finally, when we talk about this war of attrition, these 3 weeks of fighting have just worn Hancock down. And so the most aggressive corps commander in the Union Army has to wait for cars to go by so he can talk about his orders. The most aggressive commander in the Union Army is going to become uncharacteristically nervous, and he's going to hunker down on a high prominence off in that direction and wait for Grant to spring his trap. Grant's coming. Grant will be able to kind of get Hancock out of this, but there's not really a fix for Hancock to be in. He just thinks there is. He's got himself worn down and psyched out. In the meantime, Grant's going to be moving along a bunch of different roads on the 21st and then into the 22nd. The 22nd is when he'll finally reconnect with Hancock, and things will start moving again toward the North Anna River. We're going to head in that direction now. Finally, wrapping up our federal advance down to the North Anna River, we are at Carmel Church. Ulysses S. Grant won't actually arrive here until the morning of May 24th, but this area is the convergence of his army as it comes down from Spotsylvania toward North Anna in pursuit of Lee. When Grant originally sent the 2nd Corps down toward Bowling Green, toward Milford Station, hoping they might even get as far across the river as Hanover Junction, he was dangling them out there as bait. But as I mentioned a second ago, the communications between the 2nd Corps and the rest of the army were really sketchy and tenuous. And so Grant started to get nervous and began to second guess himself. So he then will send the 5th Corps in pursuit. He'll also then pull out the 5th and 6th Corps to follow up. The 5th Corps is going to basically follow much of the 2nd Corps' route. The 9th Corps is going to kind of filter through some of the side roads in that direction. The 6th Corps will be able to actually get onto what is today modern Route 1, the Telegraph Road, and kind of get the straight shot down eventually. But that all is going to take some time. Through some clever delaying action by Richard Ewell in the 2nd Corps, some of his engineers, along with the natural temerity of Ambrose Burnside, the Federals aren't able to make a push down here, which gives Lee that inside track and lets Lee come down the Telegraph Road, which is right off there in that direction, and get across the river first on the 22nd. We'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow. In the meantime, Grant's going to kind of grope across the countryside trying to follow up his bait. Hancock, nervous, hunkered down. Grant, very aggressive, usually is now starting to second guess himself. He is really not thinking about the offense, but really worried about what Lee's going to do to him, which is a complete turn in character for Grant. So we're starting to see this war of attrition wear down the generals themselves. It's going to start to get reflected in the leadership of the armies, which we'll see on both sides. We'll talk more about that impact on Robert E. Lee when we take up his position tomorrow along the banks of the North Anna River on the south side of the river. I'm Chris Mackowski for Emerging Civil War. So glad to have you with us here for the 155th anniversary of the Overland Campaign as we're heading down into the most overlooked phase of the Overland Campaign, the North Anna River. Thanks for joining us.